Theodore Vance never told his son what he kept hidden inside the antique French mantel clock at the back of his repair shop. When Julian married a woman who saw Theo's life's work as nothing more than a number on a balance sheet, the old watchmaker made sure every move she made was documented. One afternoon, his shop assistant, Evelyn, called him from the back room, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Vance, you need to come see this. Your daughter-in-law is in here and she's going through your desk." Theo had been waiting 18 months for this exact moment, and everything he had quietly prepared was about to change the direction of his family forever. Theo did not gasp. He did not flinch, nor did he drop the delicate brass gear he had been holding between his precision tweezers. Decades of working with mechanisms that required absolute stillness had taught him how to command his own pulse. He set his tools down on the green felt mat with practiced care, wiped his hands slowly on his canvas apron, and walked silently toward the doorway where Evelyn stood. The older woman was trembling. Her eyes were wide with a volatile mixture of outrage and disbelief, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt. Theo gently raised a single finger to his lips, asking for absolute silence. He motioned for her to step back into the deep shadows of the hallway, away from the line of sight of the office door. He did not storm into the room to confront the intruder. Confrontation born of anger was a tactic for the unprepared, and Theodore Vance was anything but unprepared. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder and guided her into the narrow storage closet adjacent to the main workspace. Just 1 week prior, Theo had asked a discreet private technician to install a closed-circuit camera system. The tiny lenses were hidden seamlessly behind the ornate crown molding of his private office, invisible to the untrained eye. Inside the dim, dusty closet, a small flat-screen monitor glowed with a pale and revealing bluish light. On the screen, the high-definition feed displayed Victoria in startling clarity. She looked entirely alien in a room built on history, oil, and worn wood. She wore a tailored designer coat, her hair perfectly styled to project an image of effortless wealth and untouchable grace. Yet her actions were those of a common, desperate thief. Theo watched in heavy silence as her manicured fingers slid expertly past the decoy papers on top of his desk. She went straight for the heavy bottom drawer. She produced a small silver key from her designer handbag, a key she had undoubtedly copied from Julian's own keyring during a moment of misplaced trust. The drawer slid open with a faint metallic whisper. Victoria did not hesitate to dig deep. She bypassed the daily ledger and the supply receipts, her hands reaching into the very back to extract a thick, sealed manila folder. Even through the security footage, Theo recognized the embossed seal on the heavy parchment. It was the original deed to the Old Town Alexandria property. The building had stood on the historic King Street for over 100 years, representing a legacy of artistry and family dedication. To Theo, it was home. To Victoria, as she laid the documents flat under the warm glow of the desk lamp, it was merely a prime commercial real estate asset waiting to be liquidated. Beneath the deed lay something far more personal. Victoria pulled out a secondary file containing Theo's comprehensive medical records. She drew her sleek smartphone from her coat pocket. The screen flashed once, twice, 3 times, capturing the delicate details of his cardiology reports and his daily blood pressure readings. Evelyn let out a muffled gasp beside him, her hand flying to cover her mouth in pure horror. Theo simply stood like a statue carved from old oak. He felt a profound and heavy sorrow settle deep in his chest. This sorrow was not for himself, but for Julian. His boy, his brilliant and gentle son, was sleeping next to a predator who was meticulously calculating the exact timeline of her father-in-law's demise. On the monitor, Victoria finished her grim photography. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. As she meticulously returned the files to their exact positions, a chilling smile touched her lips. It was a cold, triumphant curve of the mouth, the expression of a hunter who firmly believed she had outsmarted her prey. She locked the drawer, smoothed the front of her expensive coat, and glided out of the room, leaving absolutely no visible trace of her intrusion. Theo and Evelyn waited in the cramped darkness until the familiar chime of the front door signaled that Victoria had exited the shop. Evelyn turned to him, her voice shaking with quiet fury. She pleaded with him to call the police or to phone Julian immediately so his son could see the truth. Theo shook his head slowly. He thanked Evelyn for her unwavering vigilance and asked her to lock up the front of the shop for the evening. When he was finally alone, the profound silence of the shop enveloped him, broken only by the rhythmic heartbeat of 100 ticking clocks. Theo walked slowly into his office. The air still carried the faint, expensive scent of Victoria's perfume, a sharp and toxic contrast to the familiar, comforting aroma of aged wood and brass polish. He did not check the drawer to see if things were out of place. He did not need to. Instead, he walked over to the antique French mantel clock resting on the sturdy mahogany shelf. He ran his calloused fingertips along the intricate bronze mounts and the rich, polished veneer. The clock ticked with a steady, unwavering certainty. He closed his eyes and thought of Eleanor, of her brilliant foresight, and of the secrets she had buried inside this very case 10 years ago. The final piece of evidence was now safely recorded on a digital drive. The long game of patience was over, the heavy gears had finally clicked into perfect alignment, and it was time to prepare the final strike. The steady ticking of the antique French mantel clock seemed to pull Theodore backward through time, rewinding the delicate gears of his memory to a crisp autumn afternoon exactly 18 months ago. That was the day the quiet, predictable rhythm of Vance's antique horology experienced its very first fundamental disruption. Julian had called earlier that morning, his voice vibrating with a bright, nervous energy that Theo had not heard since his son was a young boy. He was bringing someone truly special to meet his father. Theo had been meticulously reassembling the mainspring of a 19th-century pocket watch when the familiar brass bell above the front door chimed. Julian walked in, his face glowing with the kind of pure, unguarded pride that only a deeply loving and vulnerable heart could project. He held the hand of Victoria Sterling, introducing her as a senior executive in commercial real estate development. Theo had wiped his hands on his heavy canvas apron, stepping out from behind the worn mahogany counter with a warm, welcoming smile completely prepared. Victoria possessed a sharp, striking beauty that demanded immediate attention. Every single element of her appearance was carefully curated to project authority, success, and an untouchable status. Her grip, when she shook his hand, was firm, practiced, and entirely devoid of genuine warmth. As Julian eagerly led her around the showroom, pointing out the original heart pine floorboards and the intricate crown molding that his grandfather had installed, Theo watched the young woman carefully. Victoria did not look at the rare German bracket clocks or the delicate painted porcelain dials. She did not ask about the history resting on the shelves. Instead, her eyes moved rapidly and systematically. She was sweeping across the ceiling height, calculating the width of the large display windows, and measuring the deep footprint of the prime King Street location. She was mentally stripping the historic walls down to the bare studs. Theo watched as she took in the expensive brick facade and a heavy foot traffic passing by outside. She was not seeing a sanctuary of history or a beloved family legacy. She was conducting a silent, brutal geometric calculation of commercial value. She turned back to Theo with a perfectly symmetrical smile. She declared that the shop was absolutely charming, her voice smooth and polished like cold marble. But the word did not sound like a compliment to the old watchmaker. It sounded exactly like an opening bid. Theo had spent his entire adult life diagnosing invisible flaws inside complex, enclosed mechanisms. Because of this, he could easily recognize the subtle mechanics of pure ambition disguised as polite interest. He saw the exact same predatory gaze in the eyes of estate liquidators who hovered like vultures over family tragedies, waiting to harvest the remnants of a life well lived. A cold, heavy knot formed in his stomach. A quiet alarm bell warned him that this polished woman was not looking at a future father-in-law, but rather at a stubborn, aging obstacle standing between her and a highly profitable asset. Yet, when Theo looked away from Victoria and focused on Julian, his heart ached. His son was utterly blinded by infatuation. Julian looked at Victoria as if she had hung the moon and the stars in the sky just for him. Theodore forced the cold knot down deep inside himself. He told himself he was just being a protective, overly cynical old man. He desperately wanted his son to find the kind of enduring, profound love he had shared with his late wife, Eleanor. So, Theo swallowed his sharp instincts, smiled warmly back at Victoria, and officially welcomed her into their small family. 9 months later, that same knot of dread returned during an extravagant wedding ceremony. The event was held at a sprawling, historic vineyard estate in rural Virginia, and it was a flawless, high-budget production. The gathering felt less like a celebration of two souls uniting and much more like a masterclass in aggressive corporate networking. The guest list was heavily populated by Victoria's wealthy clients, corporate investors, and sharp-suited property developers. Theo, dressed in a modest but well-tailored classic suit, felt acutely alienated in the middle of his own son's milestone. He sat quietly at the beautifully decorated head table, feeling the crushing absence of Eleanor. He wished desperately that she were sitting beside him to offer her legendary intuition and calm his restless, worried mind. During the ceremony, he had watched Julian stand at the altar, tears streaming down his face as Victoria walked down the aisle. Julian was weeping from pure, unadulterated emotion, completely overwhelmed by the gravity of his vows. Victoria, however, maintained a flawless smile. Her makeup remained entirely immaculate, her composure absolute and unbreakable. She looked less like a woman surrendering her heart to a lifelong partner and more like a triumphant chief executive successfully closing the most lucrative acquisition of her entire career. Later that evening, as they danced their first dance, she rested her head on Julian's shoulder. But Theo, watching from the shadows of the banquet hall, noticed her eyes. They were wide open, scanning the opulent room, assessing the crowd, and perpetually calculating the value of her newly conquered domain. The first few months following the grand wedding passed with a deceptive and fragile peace. Julian and Victoria moved into a sprawling, ultra-modern townhouse in an upscale suburban development just outside the city limits. It was a sterile environment composed entirely of polished concrete, sheer glass, and minimalist white furniture. The space was completely devoid of history or warmth, serving as a perfect physical reflection of its newly minted lady of the house. To maintain the sacred bonds of family, Theo established a quiet tradition of visiting the couple for dinner on the first Sunday of every month. He would arrive carrying a bottle of good vintage wine or a decorative box of sweet pastries from Julian's favorite local bakery, carrying the desperate hope of finding the joyful, relaxed son he had known all his life. Instead, month after month, he found a young man who was slowly and methodically being reshaped by a master sculptor. The manipulation did not arrive like a sudden, violent storm. It crept into the dining room like a slow, invisible winter draft, chilling the atmosphere degree by excruciating degree. Victoria was far too intelligent to make direct demands or issue ultimatums. Instead, she chose to weaponize the very concept of familial concern. She would play the role of the devoted and loving daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She would pour Theo a glass of expensive Bordeaux, lean across the pristine surface of her dining table, and rest her manicured hand gently over his calloused knuckles. Her voice would soften into a carefully calibrated frequency of artificial empathy, creating a beautiful, velvet-lined trap woven entirely out of polite inquiries and feigned affection. It began in earnest right around the 5th month of their marriage. The dinner table conversation had naturally drifted toward the upcoming winter season and the biting, damp cold that often seeped into the older brick buildings of the historic district. Victoria took a delicate sip of her dark red wine and let out a soft, highly theatrical sigh. She tilted her head, locking her sharp, calculating eyes onto Theo. She asked him, with a voice dripping with manufactured pity, if he ever simply grew utterly exhausted from spending his golden years hunched over a cluttered workbench. She painted a bleak, highly exaggerated picture of his daily routine, asking how his aging back could endure the constant physical strain of standing in that dusty, poorly lit basement workshop day after day. She managed to make his lifetime of passionate craftsmanship sound like a cruel, inescapable prison sentence that he was too stubborn to abandon. Theo had smiled politely, though his internal emotional defenses instantly snapped to high alert. He explained quietly that the work gave him profound purpose, that the intricate, precise mechanics of the antique timepieces kept his mind sharp and his hands remarkably steady. But Victoria was not genuinely interested in his passion or his artistic fulfillment. She merely nodded her head, treating his heartfelt explanation like the stubborn, irrational ramblings of a confused old man. Then, she smoothly and effortlessly pivoted to her true objective. The pivot was seamless, executed with the cold precision of a seasoned corporate negotiator closing a hostile takeover. She casually shifted the topic from his physical health directly to the exploding commercial property market. She noted, with a sudden gleam of genuine, unmasked hunger in her eyes, that the real estate valuations in Old Town Alexandria were currently experiencing an unprecedented, astronomical surge. The historic district, she explained, was rapidly becoming a highly coveted playground for luxury boutique developers and wealthy franchise owners. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and asked if he had ever given serious, practical thought to establishing a comprehensive retirement fund. She suggested gracefully that he was currently sitting on a golden opportunity to finally relax, to travel the world, and to leave the heavy, unnecessary burdens of building ownership behind him while the market curve was at its absolute peak. Theo listened to the smooth, rhythmic cadence of her pitch, his heart sinking heavily within his chest. The pain he felt was not because of her obvious greed, but because of Julian. He glanced across the table at his son, desperate to see a spark of defense, a gentle reminder from the young architect that the shop was the enduring, sacred legacy of Eleanor Vance. But Julian simply sat there, quietly eating his dinner, nodding in silent agreement with his wife. The young man looked at his father with genuine, misplaced worry, completely convinced that his brilliant and successful wife was simply looking out for an aging man's best interests. Julian had entirely absorbed her toxic narrative without question. That was the exact moment the final, lingering veil of denial fell completely from Theo's eyes. As Victoria continued to talk casually about asset liquidity and maximum equity extraction, Theo realized the horrifying truth of her perspective. When Victoria looked at the heavy, hand-carved oak doors of Vance Antique Horology, she did not see the beloved place where Julian had taken his very first steps. When she looked at the meticulously restored French mantel clocks or the antique leather-bound ledgers filled with Eleanor's elegant handwriting, she did not see a family's beautiful soul poured into a noble, dying trade. She saw absolutely nothing but a massive, frozen pile of capital. She viewed his entire existence, his cherished memories, and his sacred, unbreakable connection to his late wife as nothing more than a stagnant financial portfolio that urgently needed to be liquidated and immediately absorbed into her own growing empire. Theo did not argue. He did not raise his voice, nor did he attempt to fiercely defend his territory. Doing so would only allow Victoria to paint him as hostile, paranoid, and ungrateful, effectively driving a wedge even deeper between him and his beloved son. He simply took another slow bite of his meal, offered a vague, non-committal smile, and thanked her politely for her highly thoughtful advice. He played the part of the slow, tired, traditional artisan perfectly. But that night, after driving home through the quiet, rain-slicked streets of Alexandria, Theo did not go upstairs to his comfortable apartment. He unlocked the heavy front door of the shop, turned on the single brass lamp situated above his main workbench, and sat down in the profound, ticking silence of his domain. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, reached past the supply receipts, and withdrew a brand new, dark green leather-bound notebook. He opened it to the very first blank page. With a remarkably steady hand and a cold, protective resolve hardening in his chest, he wrote down the exact date, the location of the dinner, and every single toxic, probing question Victoria had asked him. The old watchmaker knew with absolute certainty that the hidden gears of a hostile takeover had officially been set into motion, and he was fully prepared to document every single click of the mechanism. The poison Victoria poured during those monthly dinners did not remain confined to the dining table. It seeped slowly into the very fabric of Julian's daily life, acting as a slow-release toxin that targeted his deepest loyalties. For his entire adult life, Julian had maintained a sacred Sunday morning tradition with his father. Rain or shine, the young architect would walk through the heavy wooden doors of the repair shop at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. They would share strong black coffee and thick slices of toasted sourdough, talking about everything from the intricacies of historical building restoration to the quiet, lingering grief of losing Eleanor. It was the anchor of their week, a dedicated space where they could simply be a father and a son existing in perfect harmony. By the 7th month of the marriage, that vital anchor began to slip. It started with brief, apologetic phone calls on Saturday evenings. Julian would claim he was simply too exhausted from a grueling work week to make the drive across town the following morning. Then the excuses evolved into something much more structured. He would say Victoria had scheduled a sudden brunch with prospective investors, or that she deeply desired for them to spend their weekend mornings more intentionally as a married couple. Theo understood exactly what intentional meant in Victoria's vast, clinical vocabulary. It meant isolating the primary target. It meant systematically severing the emotional lifeline that kept Julian anchored to his family and his history. When Julian did manage to visit the repair shop, his entire demeanor was noticeably altered. The vibrant, passionate young man who used to marvel at the complex escapement mechanisms of antique pocket watches was entirely replaced by someone who looked perpetually tired and deeply distracted. He would sit on the edge of the leather armchair, constantly checking his sleek mobile phone as if waiting for permission to simply exist in the room. His posture was rigid, and his once easy laughter had vanished completely. During one particularly quiet Sunday visit in late November, Julian casually mentioned that he was feeling stifled at his architectural firm. He repeated, almost verbatim, a phrase Theo recognized instantly as Victoria's corporate doctrine. Julian stated that staying attached to traditional methods was a sign of a controlling mindset and that a man of his profound talents needed to focus entirely on building his own independent empire. The word empire sounded utterly ridiculous coming from Julian, a man who had always valued quiet artistry over aggressive ambition. Theo listened carefully, masking his growing horror, as his son explained that perhaps his father's deep attachment to the old town shop was unknowingly holding both of them back. Julian stared down at his cooling coffee cup, unable to meet his father's eyes. Victoria had somehow convinced him that the historic building was not a shared legacy to be fiercely cherished, but rather a heavy anchor of emotional obligation permanently tied around his neck. She had smoothly planted the insidious idea that Theo was actively using the unspoken promise of inheritance to keep his son subordinate, financially dependent, and overly obedient. She was painting a picture of Theo as a manipulative patriarch refusing to let the next generation thrive. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the psychological manipulation took Theo's breath away. He sat across the small wooden table, watching his beloved child struggle under the immense weight of manufactured guilt. Julian was fighting a phantom enemy that his wife had carefully constructed inside his mind. Every protective, paternal instinct in Theo's body screamed at him to reach across the table, to grab his son by the shoulders, to shake him awake from this nightmare, and to expose Victoria for the cold, calculating parasite she truly was. He wanted to shout that she was slowly draining the life from him. But the old watchmaker forced his hands to remain perfectly still on his lap. Decades of working with highly sensitive machinery had taught him the devastating consequences of acting on impulse. He knew with absolute certainty that any aggressive defense would instantly validate Victoria's poisonous narrative. If he pushed back with righteous anger, he would immediately become the controlling, bitter patriarch she claimed him to be. He would prove her right in Julian's eyes. He would lose his only son forever in a single afternoon of misplaced rage. So Theodore Vance did the hardest thing a father could possibly do. He made the agonizing choice to let his son drift away into the fog. He smiled softly, offered gentle words of unconditional encouragement about Julian's architectural career, and poured a second cup of coffee as if his own heart were not actively breaking into 1,000 tiny, irreparable pieces. He swallowed his pride and his fear, wrapping his son in a quiet, undemanding love. But as soon as the front door clicked shut behind Julian, the soft smile vanished from Theo's face. The grandfather clocks in the showroom continued to chime, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding within their walls. Theo retreated to the dim solitude of his back office. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, took out the dark green leather notebook, and uncapped his fountain pen. With meticulous precision, he documented every subtle shift in Julian's vocabulary, the specific dates of every missed Sunday visit, and every toxic seed Victoria had successfully planted and nurtured. The blank pages slowly filled with the heartbreaking, chronological record of a stolen son. Theo was silently building an impenetrable fortress of meticulous records, trading his present happiness for the agonizing, unyielding patience required to win a war his son did not even realize he was fighting. The heavy silence of the shop pressed down on Theodore as he closed his dark green notebook. It was past midnight. The only illumination in the room came from the small brass lamp on his desk, casting long, wavering shadows across the antique tools and the countless gears scattered across his workbench. The profound isolation of his secret documentation was beginning to crush his spirit. He felt entirely alone in a terrifying battle, fighting a phantom in the dark to save a son who did not even realize he was being taken captive. He rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the sheer weight of his 68 years settling deep into his bones. In the oppressive quiet, his gaze drifted upward, settling on the antique French ormolu mantel clock resting on the highest mahogany shelf. The delicate brass pendulum swung back and forth, slicing through the stillness with perfect, unwavering rhythm. Looking at that magnificent piece of history, Theo was instantly transported back 10 years, to the final, agonizing months of Eleanor's life. Even as the illness was slowly draining her physical strength, his brilliant wife had insisted on coming down to the workshop. As the former head of archives at the Library of Congress, Eleanor had possessed an unparalleled mind for uncovering buried truths and recognizing dangerous patterns. She had spent her final weeks meticulously restoring that specific French clock. 2 days before she was permanently confined to a hospital bed, she had placed the clock on that very shelf. She had looked at him with her piercing, intelligent eyes, her voice faint but carrying an absolute command. She had told him that a time might come when Julian's pure, trusting heart would make him vulnerable to those who sought to consume their legacy. She had told him that when that time finally arrived, he would know exactly where to look. For 10 long years, Theo had believed she was speaking metaphorically, urging him to look inward for strength. But tonight, driven by a desperate, overwhelming need for his wife's guidance, a sudden realization struck him like a physical blow. He stood up from his chair, his joints aching in the cold dampness of the basement, and walked slowly toward the shelf. He reached out with trembling hands and lifted the heavy French clock, carrying it over to the soft felt mat on his workbench. He turned the magnificent timepiece around, his expert fingers trailing over the intricate bronze mounts and the polished fruitwood base. He pressed his thumbs against the corners of the heavy wooden bottom, applying gentle, even pressure. There was a soft, almost imperceptible click. A hidden spring mechanism, brilliantly engineered and seamlessly disguised within the ornate molding, released its tension. A false floor dropped open, revealing a shallow, perfectly concealed cavity. Inside the hidden compartment lay a thick, airtight archival envelope. Theo felt his breath catch in his throat as he carefully pulled it out. The plastic seal was pristine. He opened it with agonizing slowness, pulling out a stack of documents. On top of the papers was a handwritten letter on Eleanor's personal stationery. Even after 10 years, the faint scent of her lavender perfume seemed to rise from the paper. He read her elegant, flowing script through eyes blurred with hot tears. Eleanor had written that she knew Julian would one day become a target. Their son possessed a beautiful, gentle soul, but he was inherently blind to malice. Eleanor had spent her career archiving the history of Old Town Alexandria, and she had seen firsthand how ruthless corporate predators systematically targeted historic properties, tearing apart grieving families to acquire prime real estate. She warned Theo that these vultures did not always attack from the outside. Sometimes, they infiltrated the family itself. Beneath her heartbreaking letter was a thick dossier of court records, property transfers, and civil litigation files that Eleanor had quietly compiled during her final year. Theo stared in absolute shock at the name printed on the very first legal document. It was Victoria Sterling. 10 years ago, Victoria had been a young, wildly ambitious operative in her early 20s. She had married the sole heir of a prominent, vulnerable local family following the death of their patriarch. The documents detailed exactly how Victoria had systematically isolated her young husband, manipulated his finances, and ultimately forced the liquidation of his family's historic estate. She had walked away with a massive settlement, leaving a shattered dynasty in her wake. Eleanor, noticing the terrifying pattern of this rising real estate shark operating in their district, had gathered the evidence to protect her own family, burying it in the clock just in case the predator ever set her sights on the Vance legacy. Tears spilled over Theo's lower eyelids, dropping silently onto the polished wood of his workbench. He wept for the profound, enduring love of his wife, a woman whose fierce protective instincts had somehow transcended death itself. She had seen the gathering storm long before it ever formed on the horizon, and she had left him the exact weapon he needed to survive it. As Theo carefully folded the documents and placed them back inside the archival envelope, the crushing sorrow in his chest evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a cold, hardened armor of absolute resolve. Victoria believed she was dealing with a tired, oblivious old watchmaker. She had absolutely no idea that she was actually fighting a man armed with the devastating foresight of an archivist who had already mapped out her entire playbook. Theo slid the false floor back into place, listening to the satisfying click of the hidden lock. He wiped his face, straightened his posture, and looked around his beloved shop. He would not let this woman turn his family's sacred history into a liquidated asset. The time for quiet, passive observation was officially over. It was time to go to war. The morning after discovering Eleanor's hidden dossier, Theodore Vance did not open Vance Antique Horology at his usual hour. Instead, he left Evelyn in charge of the front counter and walked 3 blocks down King Street, blending perfectly into the crisp morning foot traffic. His destination was a stately brick building housing the law offices of Harrison Cole. Harrison was a man of quiet dignity, a seasoned attorney who had handled the Vance family estate for over 3 decades. When Theo sat down in the heavy leather wingback chair across from Harrison, he did not waste a single moment on pleasantries. Theo explained the subtle, toxic shifts he had observed in his son and the cold, calculating questions Victoria had been asking. He did not yet reveal the devastating contents of Eleanor's hidden envelope, preferring to hold his most powerful weapon closely guarded until the absolute perfect moment. For now, he simply instructed Harrison to restructure the entire family trust. They spent 3 meticulous hours drafting airtight legal clauses. The new provisions dictated that the historic building and the business assets would pass into a conditional trust rather than a direct, liquid inheritance. If Theo were to pass away, Julian would retain full operational control and the right to the shop's income, but he would be legally prohibited from selling, transferring, or borrowing against the physical property for a minimum period of 25 years. The legacy of Eleanor Vance was officially locked behind a legal vault that no real estate developer could ever crack. Harrison removed his reading glasses and looked deeply at his oldest client. The lawyer asked if Theo believed his life or his assets were in immediate danger. Theo answered quietly that a man did not wait for the rain to start falling before he decided to fix the holes in his roof. The legal fortification was only the first step. 2 days later, after the shop had closed and the heavy velvet curtains were drawn across the front windows, Theo welcomed a new visitor through the back alley entrance. Silas Thorne did not look like a man who spent his life hunting down other people's secrets. The former federal investigator was remarkably plain, wearing a nondescript gray suit and possessing a calm, entirely forgettable face. This deliberate invisibility was exactly why Theo had hired him. Theo poured them both a cup of dark coffee and laid out the situation with the same precise, clinical detachment he used to diagnose a shattered clock movement. He handed Silas a slip of paper bearing Victoria's full name, her corporate title, and the address of her firm. He told the investigator that he needed absolute, irrefutable proof of her current intentions regarding his property and his family. He needed to know who she was meeting, what she was planning, and how she intended to execute her strategy. Silas listened without interrupting, his dark eyes absorbing every detail. When Theo finished speaking, Silas asked only 3 questions. He asked if Julian knew about the investigation. Theo said no. He asked if Theo had legal representation standing by. Theo confirmed he did. Finally, Silas asked how much time they had. Theo looked at the steady swing of the grandfather clocks in the dark showroom and replied that they had exactly as much time as they needed to get it right. Thus began a masterclass in duality. Over the next several months, Theodore Vance lived two entirely separate lives, existing simultaneously in the bright light of day and the deep shadows of night. During the business hours, he was the beloved, eccentric grandfather of Old Town Alexandria. He stood behind his polished wooden counter, offering warm smiles to tourists, cleaning delicate enamel dials, and listening patiently as Julian made his increasingly rare, painfully brief visits. Theo played his part flawlessly, nodding along with Victoria's false concern at their monthly dinners and allowing her to believe he was nothing more than a tired, oblivious artifact slowly fading into history. But when the sun set and the heavy brass deadbolts were thrown into place, the artisan transformed into a general commanding a silent war. Sitting alone under the pool of light from his desk lamp, Theo would open his dark green leather notebook to record the latest encrypted messages from Silas Thorne. He studied the legal briefs sent over by Harrison Cole, memorizing every clause and contingency. He cross-referenced Silas's preliminary findings with the decade-old court documents Eleanor had left behind, mapping out Victoria's behavioral patterns with chilling accuracy. Theo learned to compartmentalize his profound grief and his simmering rage, treating them like volatile chemicals that needed to be stored in secure, separate containers. He knew that the slightest slip in his facade, a single misplaced glare or an uncharacteristically sharp remark during a Sunday dinner, would alert Victoria to the trap being laid beneath her feet. He had to let her feel powerful. He had to let her feel entirely in control. He was applying the ultimate lesson of horology to his own life. The most complex and dangerous mechanisms required the most exquisite patience. He would not force the gears to turn. He would simply wait in the shadows, quietly sharpening his tools, until Victoria unknowingly walked directly into the crushing teeth of the machine he had built for her. Autumn arrived, bringing a bitter, biting chill to the historic brick-paved streets of Old Town Alexandria. With the changing of the leaves came the first substantial harvest of Silas Thorne and his meticulous, invisible labor. Late one Tuesday evening, long after Evelyn had gone home to her family and the heavy brass deadbolts of the front door were securely locked, the private investigator arrived through the dark alleyway entrance. He moved without making a sound, carrying a thick, unmarked leather briefcase that seemed incredibly heavy. Theo sat at his worn wooden desk, the small brass lamp casting a warm but fragile pool of light against the encroaching shadows of the basement office. Silas took the seat opposite him and opened the briefcase. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone, presenting the horrifying facts without a single trace of judgment or emotion. Victoria had been exceptionally careful, Silas noted, avoiding any corporate communication channels that could be traced back to a prestigious real estate firm. But Silas was a man whose entire career was built on hunting down very careful people. First came the physical photographs. Silas laid out a series of high-resolution images captured from a discreet distance. They depicted Victoria sitting in a dim, severely outdated diner located on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was a place far removed from the polished corporate boardrooms and luxury cafes she usually frequented. Sitting across from her in a cracked vinyl booth was a man Silas identified as a ruthless commercial real estate attorney. This particular lawyer had a notorious reputation in Virginia for facilitating hostile acquisitions and successfully bypassing historical preservation laws. Silas then produced a printed audio transcript, legally obtained through a long-range directional microphone. The transcript confirmed they were not casually discussing market trends. They were explicitly outlining the local zoning regulations and the specific demolition loopholes for the Vance antique horology property. They were not talking about if they would acquire the building. They were actively calculating exactly when they could tear it down. Yet, the predatory real estate plotting was merely the prologue to the true horror. Silas reached deeper into his leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed white envelope. He slid it slowly across the polished mahogany desk. His dark, impenetrable eyes met Theo with a silent, heavy warning that the contents were severely disturbing. Theo broke the paper seal with a brass letter opener and pulled out a thick stack of intercepted digital communications and internal financial logs. Silas explained the chilling mechanism of her ultimate betrayal. Victoria had located a former college acquaintance who currently worked as an administrator at the regional office of Theo's health insurance provider. Through a series of highly discreet, untraceable cash payments, Victoria had effectively purchased unauthorized, illegal access to Theo's private medical files. Theo stared in absolute, paralyzing disbelief at the printed screenshots of his own secure patient portal. Victoria was actively monitoring his private cardiology reports, tracking his cholesterol levels, and recording the exact dosages of his daily blood pressure medication. The most devastating piece of evidence was a printed text message exchange between Victoria and her corrupted insurance contact. Victoria had noticed a recent, minor increase in Theo's blood pressure prescription. She had messaged the contact to ask if this slight adjustment indicated a significantly heightened risk of an imminent cardiac event. She was not asking out of the concern of a loving daughter-in-law. She was asking out of sheer, unadulterated anticipation. In another message, she coldly referred to Theo as an aging structural liability and explicitly instructed her contact to notify her immediately the very second any hospital admissions were triggered under his name. She was literally running a mathematical calculation on his mortality. She was watching the electrical impulses of his aging heart, waiting with bated breath for the line to go completely flat so she could immediately trigger the liquidation of his life's work. The sheer, calculated depravity of her actions made the air in the small basement office feel incredibly thick and completely unbreathable. Theo felt a violent wave of profound nausea wash over him. This was the same woman who was smiling warmly at him during their Sunday dinners. This was the woman who poured his expensive wine, touched his hand gently, and asked with feigned sweetness if he was feeling tired. All the while, she was secretly hoping that every breath he took might be his last. A crushing, agonizing sorrow gripped Theo's chest, but the pain was entirely for Julian. His brilliant, gentle son was sharing a bed with a monster. Julian was giving his heart, his absolute trust, and his future to a woman who viewed human life as nothing more than an expiring asset on a corporate balance sheet. How would Julian survive the psychological devastation when he finally saw this truth? Theo looked down at the black and white papers scattered across his desk. They laid bare the absolute evil of the woman trying to destroy his family. Any lingering hesitation, any small shred of hope Theo might have harbored that he was simply misunderstanding her intentions, vanished completely into the cold basement air. He thanked Silas Thorne for his exceptional work, paid the investigator his fee, and carefully gathered the horrifying documents. He locked them securely inside his heavy iron safe, placing them right next to the archival envelope Eleanor had left him. The trap was now fully armed and loaded with irrefutable proof. Theodore Vance had everything he needed to destroy her. Now, he simply had to wait for the final, fatal misstep that would allow him to spring the jaws shut. The heavy gray rain that washed over the historic brick streets of Old Town Alexandria seemed to perfectly mirror the bleak and suffocating atmosphere settling inside Vance Antique Horology. 2 weeks had passed since Silas Thorne delivered the horrifying medical surveillance files. Theodore Vance was sitting at his workbench, mechanically polishing a brass pendulum, when the front door chimed. He looked up to see his son walking through the entrance. Julian shook the cold rain from his dark coat, but no amount of warmth could dispel the profound exhaustion etched deeply into his features. The young architect looked terribly hollowed out, carrying a physical weight that made his shoulders slump. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the vibrant spark that had once defined him was completely extinguished. Julian did not wander the showroom to admire the ticking inventory as he used to. He walked straight to the back office and sank heavily into the worn leather guest chair. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic, overlapping ticking of the clocks and the steady drumming of the rain against the windowpane. Theo set down his polishing cloth and waited, his heart bracing for the inevitable impact. He recognized the look in his son's eyes. It was the haunted, desperate gaze of a man who had been kept awake for nights on end, subjected to a relentless psychological dripping tap until his own thoughts were no longer his own. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was flat and perfectly rehearsed. He stared down at his own hands, entirely unable to meet his father's eyes. He said he had been doing a lot of deep thinking about the future. He stated that the commercial property market was currently experiencing unprecedented growth and that holding on to a brick-and-mortar storefront in this economic climate was fiscally irresponsible. He then pivoted, his tone shifting into a manufactured, clinical concern. He told Theo that working in a damp basement was taking a visible toll on his health. He recited a chillingly familiar argument about liquidating the frozen assets, capitalizing on the peak market value, and finally allowing Theo to enjoy a stress-free retirement. Every single word, every precise corporate buzzword, was a direct echo of Victoria. Julian was not speaking to his father, he was simply playing back a recording that his wife had methodically programmed into his exhausted mind. Theo sat perfectly still, absorbing the brutal psychological blow. The agonizing pain radiating through his chest did not stem from anger toward his son. It came from the devastating realization of how thoroughly Victoria had dismantled Julian's autonomy. She had twisted Julian's genuine, deep-rooted love for his father into a weapon, convincing the young man that selling the family legacy was the only way to save Theo's declining health. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, executed with sociopathic perfection. A fierce, burning rage flared deep within the old watchmaker. He desperately wanted to stand up, march over to the heavy iron safe, and hurl the towering stack of investigative reports directly onto Julian's lap. He wanted to show his son the photographs of Victoria meeting with the demolition lawyers. He wanted to force Julian to read the intercepted text messages where his loving wife eagerly anticipated Theo's cardiac failure. But Theo clamped his jaw shut, forcing the righteous fury down into the dark corners of his stomach. If he attacked Victoria right now, Julian would instinctively defend her. The psychological chains binding the young man were still too strong. If Theo revealed his hand prematurely, Victoria would easily twist the evidence, painting Theo as a paranoid, deeply controlling old man who had illegally spied on her. She would use the revelation to sever the father and son bond permanently. The intricate trap Theo had spent months building required absolute, unwavering discipline to execute. Theo let a long, heavy silence stretch between them. He looked at Julian until the sheer weight of his gaze forced the young man to finally look up. When their eyes met, Theo did not show anger. He showed only the profound, unwavering authority of a patriarch who knew exactly what was at stake. He told Julian to stop. The command was spoken softly, but it carried a resonant, unyielding power that immediately halted Julian's rehearsed monologue. Theo leaned forward, resting his calloused hands flat on the wooden desk. He told his son that he understood the words being spoken, but he also knew exactly where those words originated. Julian opened his mouth to protest, to claim the ideas were his own, but Theo raised a single finger, demanding silence. Theo kept his voice steady and low. He said he was not going to argue about real estate valuations or retirement plans. Instead, he was going to ask for one final, monumental act of faith. He looked deeply into his son's tired, conflicted eyes and asked Julian to give him exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of absolute patience. In exchange, Theo promised that everything regarding the building, the business, and their entire future would be permanently resolved. But there was one absolute, unbreakable condition. Theo leaned closer, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. He told Julian that he must not say a single word about this conversation to Victoria. He demanded total silence. Julian looked stunned. Confusion and a flicker of genuine fear crossed his pale face. He asked his father why such secrecy was necessary, his voice trembling slightly. Theo did not blink. He told Julian that there were deeply complicated forces moving around their family, things that Julian could not yet see. He asked his son to remember Eleanor, to remember the foundation of absolute trust their family had been built upon. He asked Julian if he still trusted his father enough to grant him this one final request. Julian stared at the old watchmaker, visibly torn between the intense, daily conditioning of his wife and the lifelong, unbreakable bond he shared with the man who had raised him. The internal battle waged silently across his exhausted features. Finally, drawing a deep, shaky breath, the son surrendered to the father. Julian gave a slow, solemn nod. He promised he would give Theo the 3 weeks and that he would not speak a word of it to Victoria. Theo let out a slow, silent exhale, knowing that the final countdown had officially begun. The 3 agonizing weeks of silence that Theodore Vance had requested from his son culminated perfectly on that fateful afternoon, the exact day his shop assistant Evelyn had called him into the dark hallway to watch the security monitor. The timeline of his quiet war had officially merged with the present moment. The hidden camera footage of Victoria illegally photographing his private medical records and the historic property deed was now securely saved onto an encrypted digital drive. She had finally taken the fatal step, acting with absolute arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that she had walked directly into the center of a meticulously engineered snare. After Victoria left the shop with her triumphant, cold smile, and after Evelyn had securely locked the front doors and gone home to her family, Theo remained alone in his basement office. He did not feel the heavy exhaustion of his 68 years anymore. A cold, absolute clarity had settled deeply into his bones. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed the private number of Harrison Cole. When the seasoned attorney answered, Theo did not offer any pleasant greetings or casual small talk. He simply stared at the blank screen of the security monitor and stated that the final piece of evidence had been successfully collected. He told Harrison that it was time to execute their strategy. Harrison confirmed in a low, serious tone that all the conditional trust documents were finalized, the legal trap was completely inescapable, and he would stand by for the final phase. With the legal foundation absolutely secured, Theo disconnected the call and took a long, stabilizing breath. He then dialed his son. He let the phone ring several times, carefully adjusting his emotional posture before Julian finally answered. Theo intentionally softened his voice, modulating his tone to project the weary, heavy resignation of an aging patriarch who had finally accepted his inevitable defeat. He told Julian that he had spent the last 3 weeks thinking very deeply about their difficult conversation in the shop. He admitted, adding a touch of feigned reluctance to his words, that perhaps it was indeed time to formally discuss the transition of the business and begin the process of long-term estate planning. Through the phone speaker, Theo could hear Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief. It was the desperate sound of a young man who truly believed a grueling emotional war had just ended peacefully. Theo then smoothly suggested hosting a formal dinner for the 3 of them the very next evening. He requested a private dining room inside the most prestigious, upscale restaurant in Old Town Alexandria. Theo stressed, with a tone of utter submission, that it was absolutely vital for Victoria to be present, as they would be formally reviewing the transitional paperwork together. Less than an hour later, Julian called back to confirm the reservation. His voice was noticeably lighter, carrying a bright, optimistic energy that Theo had not heard in almost 18 months. Julian happily relayed his wife's reaction. Victoria, Julian said, was absolutely delighted by the invitation. She had called the upcoming dinner a wonderful, mature step forward for their family and a beautiful turning point for their shared future. She firmly believed she had won. She was entirely convinced that her relentless psychological warfare, her subtle gaslighting, and her strategic manipulation had finally broken the stubborn spirit of the old watchmaker. She was eagerly preparing to sit at a luxurious table and politely collect her massive financial prize. Theo thanked his son warmly, confirmed the reservation time for the following evening, and gently ended the call. He set the phone down on the worn green felt of his workbench. The silence in the shop was profound, anchored only by the rhythmic, overlapping heartbeat of the antique timepieces surrounding him. Theo stood up and walked over to the magnificent French ormolu mantel clock resting on the high shelf. He brushed his calloused fingertips across the polished fruitwood, feeling the invisible seam of the false bottom where Eleanor's devastating dossier rested alongside the explosive reports from Silas Thorne. His wife's brilliant protective foresight and his own unyielding patience were about to collide in a spectacular display of justice. The heavy gears were fully wound, The intricate pieces were locked perfectly into their final positions, and Victoria was happily dressing up for her own absolute ruin. The private dining room at the heart of Old Town Alexandria was a masterpiece of curated luxury. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall windows, shielding the occupants from the damp autumn evening outside. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over a pristine white tablecloth adorned with polished silver and tall, slender wine glasses. When Theodore Vance walked into the room carrying a large object wrapped in heavy canvas, Victoria and Julian were already seated. Victoria wore a tailored emerald silk dress that practically shimmered in the ambient light. She looked utterly radiant, exuding the confident, relaxed aura of a victorious general waiting to sign a treaty of unconditional surrender. A glass of expensive vintage champagne rested delicately between her manicured fingers. Julian sat beside her, and for the first time in over a year, his shoulders were not hunched with invisible weight. He smiled genuinely as his father took the seat across from them. Victoria raised her glass the moment Theo sat down. Her voice was pure velvet, dripping with a sickeningly sweet layer of artificial grace. She declared a toast to new beginnings, to making wise decisions, and to the beautiful future of their family. Theo looked at her perfect, Victoria's smile. He did not touch his glass. He simply nodded, his face completely devoid of expression, and placed the heavy canvas bundle carefully on the empty chair beside him. The dinner proceeded with excruciating slowness. Victoria drove the conversation, her tone bright and patronizing. She casually discussed luxury retirement communities in Florida and the tax benefits of liquidating commercial assets before the end of the fiscal year. Julian nodded along, occasionally glancing at his father with a look of silent gratitude, fully believing that Theo was finally finding peace. Theo ate very little. He sat perfectly still, observing the intricate, tragic play unfolding before him. He was a master watchmaker listening to the final, rhythmic clicks of a complex mechanism just before the alarm bell was scheduled to strike. When the waiters finally cleared the dessert plates and the heavy oak door of the private room clicked shut, leaving the family in absolute privacy, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to vanish. A profound, heavy silence settled over the table. Victoria dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, folded her hands elegantly over the tablecloth, and leaned forward with a bright, expectant gaze. She softly prompted Theo, asking him if he had brought the transitional paperwork for them to review. Theo did not answer her immediately. He turned to the chair beside him, lifted the heavy canvas bundle, and placed it squarely in the center of the table. With slow, deliberate movements, he untied the thick ropes and pulled back the fabric to reveal the antique French ormolu mantel clock. The polished bronze mounts gleamed under the crystal chandelier. In the quiet room, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the brass pendulums sounded incredibly loud. Victoria stared at the clock, her perfect smile faltering into a look of genuine confusion. A flicker of irritation crossed her eyes. She let out a soft, patronizing laugh, asking if this antique was meant to be a symbolic retirement gift. She added smoothly that while it was certainly a charming piece, they really needed to focus on the legal documents regarding the real estate trust. Julian looked equally bewildered, asking his father what the clock was doing there. Theo kept his eyes locked entirely on Victoria. His voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer the weary, defeated tone he had used on the telephone. It was a deep, resonant rumble, echoing with absolute, unyielding authority. He explained that his late wife, Eleanor, had spent her final weeks restoring this exact timepiece. He told them that Eleanor possessed an incredibly rare gift for seeing the deep, hidden flaws in both machines and people. He stated that 10 years ago, Eleanor had warned him that a day would come when a predator would attempt to consume their family legacy by manipulating the purest heart in the room. Victoria stiffened. Her emerald silk dress suddenly seemed too tight. Her eyes darted toward Julian, but Julian was staring intently at his father, captivated by the raw gravity in the older man's voice. Theo reached across the table and placed his hands firmly on the base of the clock. He pressed his thumbs against the concealed release points hidden within the carved wooden molding. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the dining room. The false floor of the clock dropped open, hitting the table with a dull thud. Victoria actually gasped, shrinking back in her chair. Theo reached into the hidden compartment and withdrew the thick, archival envelope. He opened it slowly, his hands perfectly steady, and pulled out the towering stack of documents he had accumulated over the past 18 months. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice a single fraction. The quietness of his delivery made the impending devastation far more terrifying. Theo laid the first document flat on the white tablecloth. It was the decade-old court record Eleanor had discovered, detailing Victoria's ruthless, successful plot to liquidate her previous husband's family estate. He then laid down the high-resolution photographs Silas Thorne had taken of Victoria sitting in the diner with the notorious demolition lawyer. He placed the printed transcripts of their recorded conversation right next to the images. Finally, Theo reached into his breast pocket and produced the high-quality, colored prints taken directly from his security camera just 1 week prior. The images clearly showed Victoria standing inside his private office, holding his medical files and the historic property deed. He arranged the documents carefully, spreading them out like a dealer presenting a fatal hand of cards. The absolute silence in the room was suffocating. Theo leaned forward, his piercing gaze pinning Victoria to her seat. He softly told her that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had looked at a grieving widower and seen nothing but a vulnerable, expiring asset. She had completely failed to realize that she had walked into a fortress built by a woman who had seen her coming a decade in advance. Theo did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone, and the printed papers spoke with a deafening volume. He methodically guided his son through the labyrinth of betrayal, pointing a steady finger at the security camera prints. He explained that exactly 1 week ago, while Julian was sitting in a corporate office believing his wife was out shopping, Victoria had violated the sanctity of the repair shop. She had used a secretly copied key to unlock Theo's private desk. She had photographed the historic property deed and, most unforgivably, his confidential cardiology files. Julian leaned forward, his breathing shallow and erratic. His hands trembled violently as he picked up the printed text message logs that Silas Thorne had intercepted. He read the words his own wife had typed. He saw the cold, clinical inquiries she had sent to her corrupt contact at the insurance company. He read the message where she noted Theo's adjusted blood pressure medication, asking eagerly if it signaled an imminent cardiac failure. The vibrant color completely drained from Julian's face, leaving his skin as pale as the crisp white tablecloth beneath his hands. A frantic, desperate energy suddenly seized Victoria. The flawless composure she had maintained for over a year shattered into jagged pieces. She scrambled to reconstruct her benevolent facade, her voice pitching higher, laced with synthetic panic. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers grasping frantically at Julian's sleeve. She insisted that his father was deliberately twisting the truth to destroy their beautiful marriage. She claimed she was merely acting out of deep, loving concern for Theo's rapidly declining health. She stammered that she had only consulted the demolition attorney to fully understand their legal options, to protect their shared financial future in case of a sudden, tragic emergency. She painted herself as a proactive, caring daughter-in-law who was being cruelly framed by a paranoid, controlling old man. But the physical evidence resting on the table was absolute and entirely immune to her sophisticated gaslighting. Julian slowly pulled his arm away from her touch, repulsed as if he had just been burned by a hot iron. He looked down at the decade-old court records detailing her identical predatory strategy with her previous husband. He looked at the indisputable timestamps on the surveillance photographs. He stared at the sheer, unadulterated malice documented in the text messages. The thick, suffocating fog of psychological manipulation that had clouded Julian's mind for 18 agonizing months evaporated in a single, devastating instant. He finally looked at the woman sitting next to him. He did not see the charming, brilliant executive he had married at the vineyard. He saw a calculated, sociopathic stranger who had systematically isolated him, hollowed out his life, and eagerly anticipated the death of the father who had raised him alone. The realization struck Julian with the physical force of a collapsing building, leaving him gasping for air in the quiet dining room. When Victoria opened her mouth to launch yet another desperate, tearful wave of manufactured excuses, Julian finally spoke. His voice was incredibly quiet, lacking any of the explosive anger she might have expected, yet it carried a heavy, devastating finality. He told her to stop talking. He said he recognized the exact cadences and the precise vocabulary she was trying to use. They were the very same phrases she had planted in his head month after month to turn him against his own blood. He stared directly into her wide, panicked eyes and asked her how she could possibly calculate the monetary value of a human life. Victoria stared back at her husband, realizing that the psychological tether she had so carefully wrapped around his mind had snapped completely. The pristine, elegant mask fell away entirely. Behind it, there was absolutely no love, no genuine remorse, and no apology. There was only the cold, hard fury of a cornered predator who realized her trap had been brilliantly inverted. She understood in that terrifying moment that she had lost complete control of her most valuable asset. To ensure the victory was absolute, Theo casually delivered the final, crushing blow. He looked directly at Victoria and informed her that she had spent 18 months plotting for absolutely nothing. He stated that the entire estate, the historic property, and all the business capital had already been legally restructured into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. He told her she would never lay a single finger on the Vance legacy. The silence that followed this revelation was total and absolute. Victoria did not scream. She did not throw her champagne glass or flip the table. She simply stood up. Her movements were stiff and mechanical as she gathered her designer coat and her expensive leather handbag. She looked down at Theo with eyes filled with pure, concentrated venom, silently acknowledging the superior intellect of the old watchmaker she had so foolishly underestimated. She glanced one last time at Julian, but her husband refused to look back at her, his eyes fixed firmly on the table. Without uttering a single word of goodbye or apology, Victoria turned on her heel and walked toward the exit. The heavy oak door of the private room clicked firmly shut behind her, severing her completely from their lives and marking the absolute end of her toxic reign. The legal aftermath of that fateful dinner moved swiftly and without the dramatic courtroom battles Victoria had undoubtedly envisioned. Armed with the devastating dossier assembled by Eleanor and the highly explosive medical surveillance evidence secured by Silas Thorne, the family attorney, Harrison Cole, ensured the divorce proceedings were remarkably brief. Victoria, deeply terrified of facing federal criminal charges for illegally accessing private health records, quietly agreed to an uncontested separation. She walked away without claiming a single penny of the Vance estate, her ambition completely shattered by the very family she had so foolishly tried to dismantle. Julian moved out of the sterile suburban townhouse immediately. He rented a modest, quiet apartment just a few blocks away from the historic brick streets of Old Town Alexandria. He spent the first few months wrapped in profound, healing silence, slowly dismantling the heavy psychological conditioning he had endured over the past 18 months. Theo did not push his son to talk. He did not demand apologies. He simply kept the heavy oak doors of Vance Antique Horology open every day, letting the steady, familiar rhythm of the grandfather clocks do the quiet work of mending a broken heart. Then came a crisp, bright Sunday morning in early winter. Theo was sitting quietly at his basement workbench when the brass bell above the front door chimed. Julian walked in, bringing the fresh winter air with him. He was carrying 2 steaming cups of dark coffee and a small paper bag filled with warm pastries from their favorite local bakery. Julian looked noticeably lighter, the dark, exhausted shadows finally fading from beneath his eyes. He did not say much as he walked into the back office and sat down on the wooden stool beside his father. For the very first time in his entire life, Julian looked at the scattered pieces of a dismantled timepiece and asked his father to teach him how to clean a clock movement. Theo smiled, a genuine, profound warmth blooming in his chest. He handed his son a small brass gear, a soft bristle brush, and a vial of specialized oil. Together, in absolute peace, they worked in the warm glow of the desk lamp. Julian, the modern architect, learned the vital, ancient lesson of patience. He learned to slow his racing mind, to handle fragile things with delicate care, and to truly appreciate the intricate mechanics of survival. Resting securely on the high mahogany shelf above them, the antique French ormolu mantel clock ticked steadily, its beautiful rhythm strong and entirely unbroken. The Vance family legacy had survived the storm, beautifully protected by the enduring foresight of a mother and the unbreakable patience of a father. The story of Theodore, Eleanor, and Julian teaches us a profound life lesson. True wealth is never measured on a corporate balance sheet. It is measured in the beautiful history we build, the unconditional love we share, and the unwavering patience we extend to the people we cherish most. Greed and toxic ambition often disguise themselves as genuine concern, hiding cleverly behind polite smiles and highly practical questions. We must always stay vigilant to protect the people and the sacred legacies that truly matter, keeping our eyes wide open and trusting only those who love us without calculation or hidden agendas. If this story resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends and family so you can listen to more engaging, emotional videos every single day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever encountered a situation in your own life where someone's true intentions were hidden behind a flawless mask of kindness? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We truly desire to listen to the feelings pouring from the very bottom of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful life, and profound peace every single day. Thank you for your time. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.